Sure. No. Well, the myth we look into now is very short and without all the curious details that a lot of the other mysteries myths that we've examined. In fact, it's so short that I have added in some adjacent myths, because otherwise we would have all interpretation and no story. There are other reasons why, and they'll come out later on. Yeah. I can do all interpretation with no story, but it's much nicer if we have a story. Let's find page 1 of the notes instead of starting at page 2. Okay, this is the last of our mystery myths. And we're going to do it in what I thought were going to be 2 short talks, but it looks like they might be 2 long talks. That's just the way it happens. But first we have a couple of side trips. In the first talk we talked about Prometheus and Lucifer. And we mentioned that myths from a spiritual point of view are literal. They represent the life principles that are within various divine beings and hierarchies of beings. And those beings cyclically live out those myths. In fact, on some levels, they're constantly living out those myths. They're also operative in the outer world in all sorts of ways, in everything from atomic interactions to societal trends and such like that. Following the maxim, as above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. So everything in the creation is lived out and acted out in the mythical stories before it comes into manifestation in the phenomenal realms. They're also to be found in our lives and in our creative expressions. In fact, our lives are made up of several myths. And if we find out and understand what myths our lives are living out, we go a long way to understanding our lives and carrying out what we want to do. We can create more, we can reap more out of our lives. Now, I have several marked characteristics in my individual horoscope, which is another indicator of the archetype of life, not the Jungian archetype. But those characteristics are several oppositions and several trines, and a very strong 7th house and an even stronger 3rd house. Almost all, in fact all of the oppositions focus on the 7th or 8th house. All the trines focus on the 3rd and 7th house. As a consequence, 2 mythical categories or 2 myths are dominant in my life. One of them, dealing with the oppositions and the 3rd house, are all the myths that have to do with communications between polarities and of alternations between opposites. And those are usually a category of myths that you find in every culture and every age of the world. They're usually indicated by fighting brothers, Abel and Cain and Jacob and Esau, Abraham and Ishmael, and Castor and Polydeuces. They fought with love. But there's usually, that's one of the themes that is common to all societies, and that's one of the myths that is most important in my life. And the realization of my life has to do with that. Another myth, the myth of the rebel, that is the myth of Prometheus and Lucifer, is another one that's important in my life. But the strongest and most influential myth in my life is the one that we begin talking about now. I have lived out this myth in several ways and on several levels. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to live it out on the levels that most of the talk is going to be about. And so we're talking about Orpheus. We're talking about a resurrection myth. And for the first one of our mystery myths, we have the primary protagonist actually going into the underworld. In Isis and Osiris, Isis never went into the realm of the dead to get Osiris, nor did Demeter for Persephone. And Dionysus Zagreus was resurrected without going into the realm of the dead. So I have a lot of insights on the nature of this myth, but unfortunately they're not going to be the subject of these talks. But I just wanted to let you know that I'll try to keep some of the biases and such that come from living inside of the myth out of the talk, but I thought it was only fair to let you know that they are there. When you experience something and all of the experiences are not yet digested, you're very likely in looking through a lens of undigested experiences, you're likely to have all sorts of biases. Now the second side trip hinges about the nature of this personage, Orpheus. Orpheus is probably the most influential myth on all of Western culture. Many of the deepest minds in the West have pondered the Orpheus myth and have actually tried to live it out in the mystery schools. Pythagoras, Plato, all of the Pythagoreans, Virgil, Offenbach, Goethe, Milton, Rilke, all of them have been very deeply influenced by Orpheus and have created on the basis of it, of this myth. Now Orpheus influenced philosophy and drama and opera and poetry and literature, movies, and even the name of our movie house downtown, the Orpheum, is all from this one thing. Now, putting these two side trips together, you can see then that I would very much like to have something that is an enormous task, and little by little I learned some of it. I would like a pretty extensive biography or bibliography of Orpheus on Western culture. Who wrote what, or what piece of music, or such like that. I'm fascinated by the evolution of an idea, its elaborations and its twists and its unfoldments and its metamorphoses and all the different interpretations that it's given, especially since it's likely to lead to something very positive in my life. So if you come across such bibliographies or references to Orpheus, I would be very thankful and beholden to you if you would note them. It's a life study for me. I've read quite a few of the Fighting Brothers myths, Bolin and Balan, if you remember them from the Arthurian Knights, the two brothers who fought, didn't know that they were brothers when they were fighting each other. They fought each other to the death. Yes, yes. But I'm more interested in Orpheus's than I am in Fighting Brothers. All right. As I said earlier, the myth is extremely short, and therefore we're going to have an elongated presentation of the myth and bring out as many esoterica about it as we can, because as I could say the myth, it may be about 5 sentences, and there would be no story. So we'll just go through the story, and with as many side trips on it as we can find. Now, Orpheus was the most famous musician of the ancient world. He was not the most talented musician. He was not the greatest musician. His brother was. His brother was named Linus. In fact, Linus was such a brilliant musician that he invented both rhythm and melody, which brings up interesting side trips, because the thing that differentiates the Western world from the Eastern world in terms of music is that melody is first found in Western music. You don't find a lot of melody in Oriental music at all. Everything stays within a harmonic structure. You know, the 3 parts of music can be related to the 3 parts of Trinity, such that rhythm is related to the Father inverted in matter as instinct, and harmony is related to the Son or to the Christ, the thing that unifies and pulls things together. And the strong individuated ego tendency is indicated by an independent line of melody. But Orpheus was more than a musician. He was a poet and bard. He could sing all of the ancient stories. He was a singer. He was a thespian. He was a philosopher. He was a mathematician, a dancer, a magician, and many other things, which is what you expect from a high initiate, that when someone has reached that level, they don't have to specialize in just one thing per life, because they have a big enough consciousness that they can develop a number of things all at the same time. In Greek, there is no real clear definition of his name. The closest that you can come is of the riverbank. And that's most likely because he wasn't a Greek. Both scholars and mystics trace him back to India. The Greeks said he was from Thrace, but anyway, Thrace meant east to the Greeks. This meant the migration of mystery wisdom from from India into Greece. And this is going the opposite way. Remember when we talked about Dionysus class? Well, you weren't here for Dionysus. Oh, you missed that. Oh, how could you? Oh, likely story. As you can see, we're, instead of just taking this only as a story, because we're looking at it a little bit historically, because Orpheus is a quasi-historical figure as well as a mythical figure. And so we're going to talk a little bit about history in this one. Now, his parentage is not unusual for mythology. His mother was one of the muses calliope, the use of music, from where music comes from, which means fair face or of the divine. And the father was the Thracian king Oeagrus, which means of the sword apple, which has something to do with the elder or mystery cult, because the names, interpretations of names are quite meaningful. And in some instances, his father was Apollo. It was not uncommon for great heroes or initiates to have dual parentage, one human parent and one divine parent. The divine parent usually being associated with the father star of the ray into which they were initiated, because that is their differential ray in all of evolution. We'll maybe start talking about that somewhere along the line. And very often it turns out that the child is also without a living earthly father. And we'll come up to that when we get to myths of heroes and heroines. When he's a little boy, Apollo gives him a lyre, but probably not the lyre, which he masters. Curious thing, there were three primary musical instruments among the gods. There was Apollo's lyre, which was created by Hermes. When Hermes stole some of Apollo's cattle, he ate one of them and was caught in the act, and he tried to bribe his way out of it by taking the gut from the cow that he had just slaughtered and stretching it across the turtle shell and making the lyre for Apollo. Mercury also invented the Pan's pipes, which were given to Pan, and probably the flute, but the flute became the property of Athena. If we look at them, all three of them represent different states of the mind. Because all music originates in the mind, because the process of thinking is a process of intonation. We're going to look at the harp a lot, probably the next time we get together. We're going to look at some of the mathematical proportionation of the harp according to the way of the Pythagoreans. And all three of them then represent different stages of the mind. The positive ability of the mind to project the thoughts of the divine individual spirit is represented by the harp, because the harp is positive. It vibrates and emanates something out from it. The Pan's pipe and the flute are more like the phenomenal realms, more like nature, because they take things into them. The Pan's pipe is mercurial in that it represents the whole spectrum of thought. When you're functioning in the realm of thinking, that you see things in wholes and not just in partials. And so when you have the Pan's pipe, you have on the whole scale right before you. Whereas the long, cross-blown flute of Athena is something that is extremely deep. The focus goes extremely deep down into the earth, and it's also very receptive in that deep way. At any rate, Orpheus masters the lyre very easily, and he became so good at it that he did very phenomenal things with it. He caused stones to move wherever he wanted them to, and always it's been the case that everything from the Great Pyramid to Stonehenge, the mythical traditions are that the stones were moved into place by music, which to some people means the ability to control internal vibes. But I won't talk about that. And he also made trees dance, which is quite a phenomenal thing. And he tamed wild animals, so that get close to anything. Now, anybody who looks at this statement would say, "Oh, this is just bragging about all his musical abilities." But anybody who looked at that would realize that those are the 3 stages of masonry before you become a human being. You pass through a mineral stone-like state where you're the rough ishler, and then you relate to the plant kingdom, to the animal kingdom, and finally as a human. And in the mineral stage, the trial in the greater mysteries is to indeed bring a mineral to a state of sentience so that it lives. And that is one of the trials of creation of the initiate. The ability to make trees dance indicates that you are raising the consciousness, or what is related to the consciousness of the plant kingdom, such that it can free itself from the earth and can move around as an animal does. And to tame the animals is to take all of the desire nature and to take that desire nature and make it work for you, which is the animal state. So all of those represent stages of human evolution. Like many of the heroes, he had a wanderlust and he had a lot of travel involved in it, which means, in a spiritual sense, that he was continuously stretching his mind into different realms. Like Dionysus, he went to Egypt. And this represents two things. You can look at all sorts of interpretations. And we're doing a little bit more line-by-line interpretation here because we're going to pad this myth a lot before we get to the ideas. And that is, Egypt is always represented, as it does in the Bible, on one level, the flesh pots of Egypt. But it also represents the seat of the mysteries in the Western world. Everybody went to Egypt to be initiated. We mentioned that when we talked about Isis and Osiris. But probably his biggest trip was he joined Jason and the Argonauts when they went on the famous quest for the Golden Fleece. We may talk about quests somewhere along the line, but if we do, we'll probably talk about the quest of the Holy Grail, which is more modern. You recognize each quest myth has to do with the sign of the zodiac that the equinox is proceeding through, the constellation. And so when the constellation processed into Aries from Taurus, the quest then became the quest of the Golden Fleece, which is an Aryan thing, and it has to do with the positive development of the etheric body. And then when the precession, just about exactly the time that the precession went to Pisces, the quest became the quest for the Holy Grail. We know that the Pisces age was an age of darkness. It didn't have all the science and philosophy that the Aryan age did. But people in the darkness of the Pisces age had to develop receptivity. And therefore the quest was to have an open cup and that kind of receptivity. We could spin off at this point onto a Jason myth, but we won't do too many spin-offs. We'll just do one primary one.
What would be the new quest?
I think it is a quest for a spiritual science. And almost everything we have right now is not that. It's either spiritual or it's science, and it is not the two put together. It's a little bit aside from where I want to go.
Yeah, I think it's just a question.
Yeah. Okay. When he was on the quest of the Golden Fleece, he was very, very influential. Everybody else was trying to prove how macho they were, how strong they were, and they were contesting with each other for who could grow the longest, who could row the longest and things like that. And Heracles snapped an oar, and he went and got a big tree and dragged it out of the woods and said, "This is going to be my oar." It was that kind of a number. You put that many men together in a boat, you got to expect that. He did all of the timing for the rowing so that they could row fast or slow and rest while they rowed, and did all of that. And he timed the passage between the clashing stones, because they had to go up the Bosporus, and they had to get past the two stones that clashed together, and he did he had the perfect musical timing. And he also urged people, especially on the return trip, when they took a very wide detour and went through all of these strange lands, even all the way to England on the way back. Sometimes they went right up the Rhine River, or up the Danube, and got all the way up into the North Sea and into England. And wherever they went, he encouraged that they respect the gods of the people and learn their mysteries and perform all the sacrifices and things like that. So he was pretty much of a universalism. And somewhere along the line, they had to go past the island of the Sirens. And different people approached the Sirens in different ways. If you remember from the Odyssey, only Odysseus heard the Sirens. He had all of the other members of his crew put wax in their ears so that they couldn't hear the Sirens, and he had himself tied to the mast of the ship so that they could hear. You know who the Sirens were. Do you remember that? They were the young women that when they sang so beautifully that they attracted you to them, and you sort of wasted your life laying at their feet. Now, the Orphic schools and the mystery schools, the Pythagoreans and the Platonists, and especially the Neoplatonists, claim that the Muses and the Sirens relate to each other. The Muses were the children of Zeus and Mimasa, meaning creative force and memory. And from them, all of the creative arts, in the sense of manipulating the world, were developed. I forget who the parentage is of the Sirens, but for every muse there is a siren. And to the Orphic mystery schools, the muses represented the proper use of the senses, so that you lived in your seeing and in your hearing and in your sense of touch in such a way that it was of a service to God, that you were using them for their intended purpose, to digest the experience of the world and to creatively see all the glories of the world. Or on the other hand, the Sirens represented the sensualistic or selfish use of each of the senses. Obviously, there are more senses than there are more Sirens and Muses than there are the senses that we agree to, but the mystery schools had a much more elaborate set of senses. I didn't want to bring that all in because it would have been too much for tonight. But the whole of it was then that the improper use of the senses, where you get addicted to them and use them selfishly for pleasure and such like that, represented being washed up on the shore of the Sirens. And when the quest of the Argo was completed, when they had the golden fleece and Jason committed all of his dirty deeds on the way, quite a few of the adventuring days were over for Orpheus. But more than an adventurer, as a true artist as he was a lover. And when he returned from the quest, he married, or almost married. It's not clear There are different versions of the myth, and some say that on the wedding day, just before the wedding, she died, and some say that it was after the wedding that she died. But they had a very, very short marriage. He married Eurydice or Agriope. They have different names. And the one name, Eurydice, means wide or broad justice. And Agriope means savage face. Both of these have to do with Libra. Broad justice is a Libra thing. We're looking at a Libra and a seventh house myth, as you may have guessed. We're talking about balance and counterpart. And the seventh house is open enemies or savage face as much as it is broad justice. They don't know whether they were actually married or not. The mystical meaning works well either way. We're going to come to that in just a little bit. But now we take a little side trip. I want to examine some myths that are almost never examined, and I'm just going to talk about some of the side myths because they're fascinating, and some of them are combinations and recapitulations of all of the other mysteries myths that we've looked at. But Eurydice lived near Tempe, near the river Peneius. And one day, as she was going along the river, some say to her actual wedding, she meets Aristeus. And he is a most unusual man. And I want to just take a side trip and look into the nature of Aristeus. Because he's quite big in mythology, only nobody ever looks at him because he's not one of the famous ones. He's a child of completely divine parentage. He's a child of Apollo, as is Orpheus, and of the nymph Cyrene. And Cyrene means either sovereign queen, or it means mistress of the bride. Now, she herself is quite a character. For when you think of a nymph, you almost think of like Errol Flynn with his young 13-year-old girls that are slim and demure and all of that. And I can still remember back in the 40s, Life magazine pictures of Errol Flynn with his teenage girlfriends, and he calls her Woodsy, short for wood nymph. And such like that. He was a total character. But Cyrene isn't like that. She's tough. She's a hunter. And Apollo fell in love with her when he saw her arm wrestling a lion and winning. And she's a foot racer. And she married Apollo, and she moved to Libya, where she became a queen. See, there were good things in Libya way before Muammar Gaddafi ever got there and messed it all up. And Aristeus was born of that union, and he had a most interesting life, more interesting in some ways than Orpheus' life. He was given all sorts of names. He was given the name Immortal Zeus, which means that he was a very enlightened young man. And he was called the Pure Apollo, and he was also called the Guardian of the Flocks. And his ancestors, the myrtle nymphs, took him out in the woods and they taught him how to make cheese. And they taught him the art of catching and taming and keeping bees. And they taught him how to take wild trees and make domestic olives out of them. So this obviously is an initiate again. And that's the next thing that happens. Apollo initiates him into his own mysteries. he is married to a nymph called Autono, and he has two children, which themselves are quite famous. One is Actaeon. If you remember, Actaeon is the one that caught Artemis bathing nude in the pond, and she turned him into a stag, and then his own hounds ripped him apart, chasing him, because nobody was supposed to see, because she was the guardian of chastity. I think the only picture that we see of Artemis these days, I think it's that ginger ale ad or whatever that is, with that woman on a rock with the little wings looking in the water. You know what I'm talking about? You still see them in ads in the New Yorker yet, I think. Although I don't often look at New Yorkers because I stay out of the doctor's offices as much as I can. And he also was father to Maris, who was one of the nurses of Dionysus, who we talked about last week. So you can see there's all tied together. The Muses also teach him healing and prophecy. And his own mother, Serene, perfects him as a hunter. And one day he's at the oracle at Delphi, and the oracle tells him he'll be very much honored if he goes to the Isle of Ceos. So he takes off and goes to the Isle of Ceos. And he learns there that one of the they have earned the scorn of Sirius, the dog star, because Icarus, when he was flying away across the Icarian Sea before he died in it, was apparently killed by the people of Ceos when he had his great fall. And Sirius was the star by which Icarus was guiding himself. I'm trying to show you how entangled all the myths get. We'll get back to what that means later on. For this reason, they had this plague against him, and everybody was dying. And he learns all of this because he has these prophetic powers, and he tells them to erect a altar to Zeus. And this is the famous cubical altar. It's perfectly cube-shaped, which represents the divine law and the divine justice. It becomes even more famous later on in the development of culture because another group of people were told that they would cure their ills by doubling the size of the altar. And it's one of the three insoluble mathematical problems, the doubling of the cube, using just the simple geometric instruments, the straight edge and the compass. It's something that can't be done, but you can't prove it until you get way into advanced calculus. And so they spent a long amount of time trying to make a double-sized cube, and they finally didn't do it. What they did is made another cube the same size as the first one and put it next to the altar. But mathematicians continued on, and they gave capital punishment to the murderers of Icarus, who they were still shielding. Zeus then gave them 40 days of good winds, and they have had all sorts of commerce and everything on the island of Ceos ever since then, and they've prospered, and they still sacrifice every year on the altar to Zeus to this day. Well, I wouldn't bet on it this day. People have become pretty worldly. And he goes back to mainland Greece, and he goes to Arcadia, which is in the middle of the Spartan peninsula, and there he builds a temple. And I don't know if you know, every single line that I've said is fraught with mystery myths. There is a whole mystery school that controls quite a bit of France, and they have been active since the days of the Crusades. And if you look in paintings of painters French painters throughout history, you see this temple on the top of a hill. It looks like the Rosicrucian temple, and it looks like the Grutenium, and it's called the Temple at Arcadia. And the Arcadians, commonly known as the Cajuns, are children of Arcady, which has to do with the North Pole, which is where all esoteric stuff comes from. And building a temple in Arcadia is a line that is fraught with all kinds of esoteric meaning. We're not going to go into all of these things, but I'm just trying to show you how jumbled and how in a few simple lines saying like, oh, he can make the stones dance, that these are symbols of very deep tasks and problems that are set before initiates in order to complete their work in the evolutionary creation. And Aristeas is such an one that had to do things like that. But he builds this temple in Arcadia, but all of his bees die. And here he is, the originator of beekeeping, and all of his bees have died. And so he goes down to the pool at Peneus, a deep pool, and somewhere along here is where he raped Eurydice in this part. But we're going to continue on the side trip for a little while. We'll get back to Eurydice in a little bit. And he dives into the pool, and he finds his mother, Serene, with the naiads deep down underwater in the pool. And they cleanse him with the spring, with an eternal spring, a fountain of youth, which we mentioned last time when we were talking about myths. And the spirits, water spirits, the naiads, tell him that he has to go see Proteus, who is the river god of all river gods. And Proteus tells him that the death of his bees is for the punishment for the death of Eurydice, and that he has to atone for it. So he returns to Cyrene, who tells him that he should build 4 altars, not to the naiads, but to the dryads. And the dryads are the nature spirits of the woods. Now, mind you, we're talking about nature magic. A lot of the initiation in ancient times, and even in Africa to this day, I have a friend from Ghana who was offered the opportunity to be initiated by the fairies and the nature spirits into the mysteries of the spiritual worlds by taking a nature spirit initiation, and he declined because he was involved with Rosicrucianism and Christianity, and he thought it was much more important to follow the Christian stream, and he set that aside. So he builds 4 altars in the woods to the dryads, and he sacrifices 4 bulls, 1 at each altar, and 4 heifers, 1 at each altar, and he pours out a blood libation. And he returns, he goes away for 9 days. Here we have the 9 days again that we had with Demeter and Persephone. And he comes back with a handful of poppies and a fatted calf and a black ewe. And he sacrifices all of the above to propitiate for the ghost of Orpheus, because Orpheus is now dead and his spirit is in Tartarus. And out of the carcasses, after the 9 days, the carcasses of the 4 bulls and 4 heifers, come the bees. I'm not even going to touch that myth. It's much too complicated to me. And he again has bees, and eventually he goes with Daedalus to Sardinia, and they live for quite a few years in Sardinia as grand old men. And finally, he moves to Thrace. And in Thrace, he studies the mysteries of Dionysus and starts the city of Aristeum. And by now, he's such a venerable mystery student that he just disappears, sort of like Lao Tzu, just disappeared. He was never seen again, just right into the inner world. And for many years, at least up until the 17th or 18th century, he was still worshipped almost like a god, in the same way that very holy people in the Christian tradition are worshipped as saints. The blood liquefied this last week again. Did you know that? You know, there's this temple in at this cathedral in Italy that where twice a year the blood of this martyr liquefies, and all the scientists are there watching. And they say, "Oh, it's because all the people are in the room watching, and the heat produces the heat from the people is enough to cause the blood to liquefy." And on the years when it doesn't liquefy, that means there's going to be a great plague or something like that for that part of it. Yeah, you're not familiar with folklore. There's a lot of things like that. Yes.
What happened to orchids? What causes?
We're coming to that. This is still the spin-off myth yet. We're done with the spin-off myth. So even though he was a very great mystery figure, he wasn't all sweetness. Because when Eurydice was walking along the same river Peneus, he rapes her, supposedly, and she resists. And she resists and tries to run away, and when she does so, she is struck in the ankle by a serpent, and she dies. Now, Orpheus, who is a lover, grieves as only a lover can grieve. And when he does so, it doesn't at all blunt his spiritedness, because he boldly decides that he's going to go into the underworld. And he goes all the way across to the other side of Greece, to Aornum. And at Aornum, where the river Aornus is, which is fairly near to the river Cocytus, he goes and descends into the underworld. You know that there were 5 rivers that went into the underworld, and there was this swamp called Styx, which was all the dead water. And this was what you had to be rowed across to enter into Tartarus. The 5 rivers were Aornus, which means birdless. I think it has to do physically with certain kinds of mineral vapors coming off the water that were toxic to birds, and they stayed away from the place. Archeron, Cocytus, Lethe, and Pyrophlegethon, meaning river of fire. And they represent 4 etheric states and the connection of the etheric realm to the desire world. Just as in the Garden of Eden, in the Judeo-Christian myth, there are 4 rivers that enter into the Garden of Eden, talking about the 4 ethers and their streams into the individual etheric body, and the Garden of Eden represents a time when we lived in the inner etheric worlds and we all had spiritual vision and we hadn't fallen down into matter and darkness and all of those things as deeply as we had. The same inner worlds, when you're dying or after death, again entering into the underworld means the world under the physical or behind the physical, and that realm has the same 4 worlds, and that shows the other polarity of the ethers. It shows the negative side of them, but we won't go into that because it's a pretty long topic. I just talk about a little bit about it, just to mention that it's there. But at any rate, Orpheus gets down into Tartarus, and he plays his music and he sings and he charms Charon, who takes him, ferries him across the swamp, and he charms Kerberos, the 3-headed dog that guards Tartarus, and he even charms the 3 judges. I don't remember their names. I know Minos and Rahamdames, and I forget who the 3rd one is. Do you remember? How could you? as a true eurythmist, you're supposed to know all of those things. In fact, his music is so beautiful that he suspends for a while all the tortures that are going on in Tartarus that we talked about in the second talk. And he even soothes Hades, and he soothes him enough for Hades to allow him to take Eurydice back to this world. However, if we remember from the myth of Demeter and Persephone, Hades doesn't do anything unconditionally. Death is like that. And his conditions are never easy, and it's very rare that his conditions are ever met. The conditions really aren't of Tartarus or Hades, but the conditions are of this world. In trying to mesh the conditions of the spiritual world and the realm of the dead who are really living into this world, this is the world that has all the limitations and all the conditions. And you can never completely bring this world to life. And so that's sort of like what the conditions are. In this case, the condition is very similar to the one at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, that he not look behind him at Eurydice until they were both safely in the sun. And you remember what happened to Lot's wife? She looked back and she turned into stone. So he starts playing his lyre, and he makes his way back up, and he gets up into the sunlight, but he looks back a moment too soon, just when she's taking her last step, and she's part in the light and part out, and he loses her forever and ever. Because when you're given an injunction, we're talking about, clearly, we'll get closer to the subject of the talk tonight, we're talking about an alchemical marriage. We're talking about a spiritual marriage of the two parts or foci of our being. And that is the same as an initiation. An initiation always has in it some sort of injunction. And that injunction is a creative work which you are to carry out without the impurity of the selfish, sinful life, but that you are to complete. And that you are to complete with we'll tie a string on it. No, you can continue on. It doesn't bother me. Now there are a lot of meanings to having something behind you. It's a very occult thing, and I don't even know all of the meaning. And as I'm a little bit hesitant about learning some of those meanings because it's the kind of knowledge that one wants to be careful of, about looking behind you. Remember when Christ wants to set temptation aside, and Peter says, well, let's bug out of here. And he says, get thee behind me, Satan. And there is something about having something work at you from behind. But I don't want to talk. It's too heavy of a theme to just take and go into now. But it was something that will come up again. But at any rate, you're given an injunction of something to do, and as a trial of your obedience. Because if you can't follow the command of the Hierophant, you can't follow the command of the divine within you, and you're not ready for initiation. And you only get one chance at it. If you miss that one chance, that's it. But at any rate, he loses Eurydice. And when he does so, as holy of a man as he is, and as beautiful of a musician and philosopher and magician and everything else that he is, he becomes even more so, and he becomes an ascetic. And this is what often happens if you suffer a very great sorrow or a very great loss. You often just drop away all sorts of other things that have before to you been very possessing kinds of sins. The reason for all of this is that when you've undergone a sorrow of immense magnitude, you recognize that so many of the things in life that you cling to are such trifling things. And it's so easy then to set them aside, because why should I bother to indulge myself in this kid stuff? Because something very, very important to me is lost. Now mind you, this is a beatific kind of falling in love that he had. He becomes ascetic to an extreme that is mortally dangerous for him, because about this time, the man that we talked about, the god that we talked about last time, Dionysus, comes into Thrace on his way back from India. And Orpheus does not honor him. And that's bad. I have to tell you my own experiences. I'll tell you some of my. I'll give you a little aside on some of my Orphic experiences. I used to go into bars, even up to a very few years ago, because I had certain friends that I would only see them in places like that. And it was all right, because I didn't drink or smoke or anything like that. I didn't deport myself immorally. But I also didn't honor Bacchus. And I didn't respect that there was a purpose to Bacchus. You know, like to wipe out involuntary clairvoyance or something like that. And as a consequence, I would always find myself engaged in conversations that are alcohol conversations, where I could literally see it. People would have the mask or expression over their face that they weren't really themselves, and they were making those kinds of arguments that mock something that is very serious and meaningful for you. And I did that until I learned that you've got to respect Bacchus. Even though you may like the ascetic life or the pure life, not to say that I'd all live a pure life, you still have to respect the other for what it is. Because if you don't, it'll mock you and it'll destroy you. And that's literally what happened. What happens is Orpheus teaches other mysteries. He teaches the mysteries of Apollo, of the sacredness of life, and of the sacredness of clear consciousness. And he said, you don't need intoxicants. It's much better to have a clear consciousness. And he said, no human sacrifices, and probably not even any animal sacrifices. And he used to go to the top of Mount Pegium every day at sunrise and probably at sunset and greet the new light. And even though he doesn't respect Dionysus to begin with, his mysteries eventually become fused with those of Dionysus. That comes later on. Cultural streams do fuse back together again when the time is right. But Dionysus becomes frustrated, and he sends the Manads after him. Remember those sweethearts that we talked about last time? And Apollo and his men, or the people that were in his school of worship, resisted the Manads. That is, they didn't go for the Bacchic revelry and dancing and fornication and things like that. Instead, he had a temple of Dium in Macedonia where he was Apollo's priests. And so much were they into the harmless way that nobody could take their weapons into the temple with them. And while they were in the temple one day, the Manads came, and they were all drunken, and they included the husbands of the people that were in the temple worshiping. And they grabbed the arms, and they murder all of the husbands, and they actually tear Orpheus apart, piece by piece by piece. we can talk a little bit about this psychologically. If we don't respect the inner other of ourselves, just like if we don't respect Bacchus, Dionysius, we're going to get whomped. And we know that within us is an inner opposite that is demonic. I've got a nasty, nasty woman inside of me somewhere. But if you don't respect that, and if you don't culture that, and if you don't treat that well, if you don't transform it, or do as the myth of Pygmalion, if you don't raise it to a higher level, it's going to turn on you. And that's clearly what the myth of the Manads means. It means that if you don't culture the inner feminine, and if you despise it, it's going to tear you apart. And it's clearly going to tear you apart when there's intoxication. You know those old statements, out of the mouths of babes and drunkards. What happens is all of the conscious control over the more primitive part of the subconscious is released in alcohol, and it comes charging out, and it'll tear you to pieces. But at any rate, the Manads tear the head off, and they throw it in the river Hebrus. And it floats, of all things, and it floats downstream, and as it's floating downstream, it sings. And it sings the hymns of Orpheus, which are, very few of them are still extant yet. And they're very beautiful hymns about the whole nature of mythology and all of the kinds of interpretations that we've been talking about. When we talked about the material, the onomastic, the physical, and the theological, those were interpretations from the Orphic hymns that the Platonists and the Pythagoreans did. And here's irony for you. It gets carried out to the sea, and where does it float? But to the Isle of Lesbos. So again, it's sort of like if you are an Orphic, you can't get away from the feminine, and if you deny it, it even takes over the masculine part of you, and that's what can happen. And I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about heart attacks and strokes. Decapitation is a very special kind of death, and people who are too heady will often lose their head. That is the capability of losing their head. And then they have to be visceral. They have to be in the body. They have to be where the heart is. And people who are too hardy, who follow their feelings to great extremes and don't do anything to control them, they have to then use their head to control their heart. Otherwise, they'll die of a heart attack. And so there is sort of like in the struggle between head and heart, the dying by decapitation represents the loss of the head function, so that more of the heart function can be fulfilled. I don't want to go into that too much. We're going to go talk about that sometime next time. And so this myth has its own polarity, that it ends up in the enemy territory. Now the Muses loved Orpheus so much, we're talking mostly about his death, more about his death than his life, as you can see, that they collected all of the pieces, especially the limbs, and they buried them at Libathra, at the foot of Mount Olympus. And to this day, the nightingales sing there more sweetly than any place else in the world. And it's sort of one of those things that even in death and decay, that there is new life. The Manads try to cleanse themselves, and they go to the river Helicon to wash the blood, And the river spirit is so offended by their murder of Orpheus that it dives underground rather than being an accessory to a murder. It dives underground and it comes out 4 miles later and it changes its name to another river called the Baphra. We're talking here, clearly the looking back is a psychological phenomenon called repression. And we're talking clearly here about the river going underground and coming up with another name is like that. This is not this is not regression. This is repression. You submerge something underground, and if you don't admit to your deeds or your accessories to your deeds, they'll come up in another form. You can't suppress things in the spiritual. But at any rate, as is often the case with ascetics, there were whispers that Orpheus and his followers were homosexuals. And Venus, Aphrodite, is very upset by this and tries to justify the murder of Orpheus to all the other Olympians. And the Olympians will have no part of it, and they'll say, no, that still was not a justified murder, because they knew it wasn't homosexuality. They knew, like the Orphics, had the doctrine of spiritual friendship, and there's a big difference between homosexuality and spiritual friendship. Socrates, Plato clearly show that doctrine, that it's all right to have a male friend that you look up to and that is somebody that you recognize as a mentor or as a counterpart for how you yourself can live your life, but it is forbidden to ever be sexual with that person. That was the teaching of the Orphics, and the Olympians knew that. And so the Olympians were going to destroy the Maenads who were involved in the murder of Orpheus, but Dionysus protected them by turning them into oaks, and that stand of oaks still stands to this day on the side of the mountain. And the head went to a cave, floated to an underground cave in Lesbos, and there a serpent struck at it. But Apollo was because the serpent was jealous, talking about, that was the ancient mysteries, where the priests of the ancient mysteries were called serpents. And Socrates and Apollo struck the serpent and turned it into stone, talking again about a petrification of something that's old and that has outlived its usefulness. And the head was set up in that cave, and it was a cave that was sacred to Dionysus, of all things. Here again we see the fusion with the opposite. This has so many marriages in the myths, that in this myth, that it's phenomenal. And what happens is that the head is put on a rude stone altar, and it sings. And it sings prophecies, and it sings oracles, until all of the oracles of Apollo are abandoned, and everybody's going to the cave of Dionysus, until Apollo finally comes to the cave and says, cease, and then it stops talking. And that is the end of Dionysus. And the lyre also floats down to Lesbos, where it is gathered up by the muses, and eventually it is taken up into heaven, and it is one of the very few articles in heaven. There are a lot of divinities and animals, and I'm talking about in the constellations. It's the constellation of Lyra, which we will be able to see probably when we walk out the door tonight. It should be up already toward the east. And it's the harp that is in heaven, and even we're talking about the realm of archetypes, and everybody thinks that you go to heaven and you play a harp, and what they're talking about is that we become, in our true nature, creative beings, and our creative being is as positive thinkers, and we're all emanating the creative archetypes to keep all of nature going. This is a big part of what our work is in between lives, is thinking the new creation into nature, and we are nature spirits, and that kind of thinking is indeed playing a harp. And there's an alternate death story of Orpheus. And in the alternate death story, Orpheus starts spreading in his Orphic hymns too many divine secrets. And so Zeus strikes him dead with a lightning stroke, and that's the end of him. And this might be a true myth because he instituted all kinds of mystery schools. He instituted an Apollo mystery school in Thrace, and he instituted a school of Hecate in Aegina, and he instituted in Sparta a mystery school for subterranean Demeter, which is a very interesting myth. If you think about it, those are the three principles in all astrology and in the whole makeup of the human being: body, soul, and spirit. The spirit is Apollo, the sun. The soul is the moon, Hecate. And subterranean Demeter is the earth. So those are the things that, it's too many asides, so that's the end of the myth. Now we'll talk a little bit about the first of 4 interpretations. We're going to next time do 3 interpretations, and talking about the harp in the same way we talked about the toys of Dionysus last time. Nobody still has come up with yet how to make a bull roar for me. If you ever run into an archaeology magazine, I'd like to. Now, so we leave off with the lyre. The constellation of the lyre in the heavens is one of the few constellations that is distinct and discrete. It stands there very clearly. You can pick it out, and it doesn't flow into any others. Almost all the other constellations in the heaven are not so distinct, and they overlap and they flow into each other, like Scorpio is well into Libra, and this tail of Scorpio is into Sagittarius, and so there's a lot of overlapping. And since the physical heavens are the closest thing that we have as a symbolic representation of the spiritual heavens, it is very much like the myths that we have been looking at tonight. The spiritual worlds are very fluent. They're very liquid, and they're blended, and they metamorphize, and worlds flow into each other. And that's one of the reasons why we looked at a spin-off myth or two tonight. Because one myth is connected to another myth. I was going to go several myths out and show how they were all connected and then come back to the original myth. Or sometimes there is a story within a story within a story, which is the whole notion of microcosm and macrocosm, which is true in the spiritual worlds. When you get into spiritual worlds, you find one realm leads to another realm, and there are meanings inside of meanings. If you read something like Swedenborg and he starts describing his clairvoyant experience, he looks at a divinity, and then the divinity opens up, and within it is an even more glorious kind of divinity, and within that is yet another. And that's why so the constellations and the constellations in the heavens are like the heaven worlds. We forbore from going too much into complications, But when we told the story this time, not only did we look at spin-offs, which we hadn't done before, but we looked a little bit more at psychological interpretations. We haven't done that much before, but when we looked at the myth of Demeter and Persephone, we looked at only 3 of the classical interpretations. We looked at a material, a physical, and a theological. And we promised that somewhere down the line that we would look at an animistic interpretation. And this is going to be our one animistic interpretation of a myth tonight. Another, animos is another name for soul. It's actually where Jung got his word for anima, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. Another name for soul is psyche. And psyche is where we get our word from psychology, or the order of the soul. Now, the mysteries teachings mean something very much different by the term psychology than psychologists like Freud and Jung, and certainly something much different than somebody like B.F. Skinner means by the term psychology. So we're going to very briefly look a little bit into psychology and some psychological problems. The similarities and the differences between mystery psychology and analytic psychology is a big, vast thing. It's something I want to go into, but I want to go into it in a 2 or 3 year advanced astrology class, but it's just not time for it now. We'll mention some things en passant. It is from the animistic, animos meaning motivating or driving soul, that Jung takes his term anima. And for Jung, the term anima means the internal feminine for someone who is overtly manifest in a material body. It's animus for a woman who has an internal masculine, coming from the same terminology. And this is what we're talking about in this myth. We're talking about the alchemical wedding with we'll talk about it from the male's point of view, with the bride that comes from heaven. And we're talking about initiation. For Jung, the interpretation of Orpheus myth would be a very, very frustrated love. Because for him, much as it is desirable to have a flow back and forth between the inner unconscious, as he would call it, and wherein dwells the self, and the outer personality, that union from a ultimate union in fusion, especially fusion, is not possible to the Jungians, because the Jungians see an impassable gulf between the material world and the realm of the unconscious. And the only thing for the Jungian between the inner unconscious and the outer material world is the bridge of symbolism. And therefore the symbol is the be-all, know-all of Jungian analytic psychology. Now, this is one statement. This is from a mysteries point of view. But it isn't really clear from Jung himself about the nature of the material to the unconscious. In one place, in his work on synchronicity, he says, yes, there are parallels between the different worlds, but there is no causal connection between them. He says that definitely, there is no causal connection between the inner worlds and the outer, because if there were, there would be magic, and we know there is no magic, and offhand he throws it out. But on the other hand, in Symbols of Transformation, he describes what happens when there is not a respecting of the inner unconscious, and it overcomes repression with great force, and it overpowers even the physical circumstance, which sounds like causality and magic to me. So it's not clear where he was on that. He's, like everybody else, his teachings are in a state of growth. The Mysteries teachings, we're trying to get to the crux of this whole issue because we have to have a moral. All stories have to have a moral. And this one has plenty of them in it. But the Mysteries teachings about the marriage are similar but significantly different. We'll examine the dilemma of Orpheus and a tiny bit of the psychology of the Mysteries along the way. But let's first put this into perspective. We, that is human beings, are in a great creation. And in that creation, something new is being drawn from the unknown. And it's being drawn from the unknown by that which knows and creates itself and is the known within the realm of all possibility. So we have the absolute, which is all possibility, and within that is the known and the self-knower, which creates, and it has this creative gesture or projection into the unknown. The unknown is almost unconscious. Now, this creation is taking place macrocosmically and microcosmically. That is, it's the whole universe, and within a human being, or within one atom. We'll limit this to human part in creativity. Within the all potential, that part of our being that is capable of knowing and which actively creates and projects itself into the unknown, and that projection becomes congealed as matter. That which does the creating, self-knowing, and projecting is called the spiritual individuality. It is symbolized by Orpheus. The part of our being or of our psychology that relates to ignorance as matter, which is capable of bearing and holding forms and is capable of being known, is the phenomenal creature of us, the personality. We've got a lot of personality these days. It is symbolized by Eurydice. It is the serpent's tail of the serpent of eternity that wraps itself around the creative egg in a circle and bites its tail. You see, the creative individuality and matter itself as the ignorance, congealed ignorance, are both part of the same thing. This is why we have that feeling when we fall in love. We see ourselves in an unknown state. In the process of falling in love, or the process of romance, of uniting, is bringing together the known and the unknown. And like all lovers, Orpheus, the spirit, and Eurydice the personality, they lean toward each other, and they influence each other, and they impinge on each other, and eventually they kiss, and they marry. This is the divine marriage, for which divorce is thoroughly the worst kind of, if you want to think in the terms of punishment. This is the irrevocable divorce, when spirit leaves all of its manifestations of personality. So what we're saying is, by a very slow evolutionary creative process, the spirit focuses deeper and deeper into matter, and matter in the terms of more and more refined forms. First they're just like statues, they're stones, and then they become like woody trees, and eventually they become soft like plants, and in a human being they come together. That a focus of the universal spirit kisses the personality and matter. And that's what we're talking about in the Orpheus myth. The consequence of this kiss and of this marriage, of this union, is what we call waking consciousness, which is not a simple thing, it's a progressive thing. Hopefully, if we're working at it as Orphics, we become more awake all the time. But it isn't a complete process, and that's the whole dilemma. This is the dilemma of Orpheus, is that the consciousness is not fully waking consciousness, nor is it completely shared by both as one. If you think about just simple male-female relationships, you never really understand the other person. And the closer you come to that, the more different it seems. The same thing happens in the marriage of Orfeo and Eurydice. Now, mind you, I got so many hours of work into these notes that it got to be that after several nights of working at 12:30 at night, I'm racing as long as fast as I can move the pencil, and you can just see the handwriting gets more and more terrible as things go along. Now, this marriage kiss is rather long. It's probably better measured in terms of hundreds of thousands of years rather than in terms of seconds. They used to have a stopwatch in Hollywood as for how long a kiss could last and have it still be decent. Well, this one is rather long. It's like hundreds of thousands of years, and you have to come up for air once in a while. And it's seen differently through different eyes. From his point of view, Eurydice, she's raped. Ugh, it's matter. It's been dragged into all of this illusion. And it's fallen. The sexual energy has been driven down into the earth. And despite the fact that he is with a fallen woman, and despite the fact that there is all sorts of illusion and all of that, he still loves her. And he still needs her. When you look at the kiss from Eurydice's point of view, he seems awfully aloof. Is he really into this? Is he removed? Is he another ascetic artist? He lives in an unobtainable spiritual light. But she loves him. And she needs him. And what I'm saying in this is that the two parts of our being and of the being of the divine, God, needs Mother Earth, so to speak. And spirit and matter need each other. The union is incomplete. And in this long process of bending toward each other, this courtship of Orfeo and Eurydice before they come together, there are all sorts of complexities. And all of these complexities between pure spirit and pure physical personality are collectively called by the mysteries soul. So that there are all sorts of life forms and form lives and things like that in between. And so in the mystery teachings, we then have spirit, soul, which is everything in between, and body. Now, the marriage work has to be completed. And even though the marriage event is shocking, and it seems like death to both of them, because Eurydice was like pure, like nature beforehand. And Orpheus was purely transcendental beforehand. And this union, this kiss, was rather shocking. But it's got to be completed. And they must enter each other's world to do it. He has to enter into the realm of death, and she has to enter into the realm of life. But how to do it? That's the real question. How to do it? See, that's the whole problem of the loss of the wife. To do this, each, in order to help each other, each must maintain its own character. A man can't emasculate himself and become effeminate to be like his bride, nor can a woman leave her feminine character and hope to be any gentilifying influence on a man unless each has their own character. But yet they must fuse together, and they must consummate the creation, and they must do this. And what we're talking about here are two spiritual processes that we've talked about before. One is the materialization of spirit. This is the creative work from the Orpheus point of view. It is taking a spiritual impulse and materializing it, even producing the matter to do so. The other is the spiritualization of matter. That is, this is a creative work in the highest sense. The potential of being waking is drawn out through matter, and it is spiritualized. It's done so by a process that is called compounding of soul. And this is a work. It is what was called the great work at one time. So it's something that we have to do, because you see what I'm, in the same way, Eurydice could not come into the spiritual light. That is to say, we can't take matter, it's an everyday thing, that, what is the common phrase that they say now, you never see a U-Haul behind a hearse. You can't, you can't take matter as is into the realm of spirit. And you can't take spirit and bring it into the realm of matter. You can't square the circle. So there's something that there has to be an interaction. This work, where even though the material world is illusion, and what it mirrors back is a set of limitations, we have to give ourselves to it totally as though it were real. And when we give ourselves to death, and my friends are going to laugh when they hear this tape. I think I've given about 6 different pronunciations of Eurydice. They're all going to laugh. They probably all know the correct Greek pronunciation and such like that. I just threw that one in just for fun. As much of these tapes is for the people, much of these talks are for the people who are in the invisible world and for the people who are going to listen to them on tape. Otherwise, I have to have an awful lot of cheek to give talks this long to this few people. So we actually give ourselves aesthetically, or we give ourselves musically, that's where the word musical comes from, to our creation, and then it becomes transformed. Gross matter can't enter into spirit, and spirit can't enter into becoming gross matter. But through them, through the interaction, through the resistance of matter and the insistence of spirit, through that interaction, in doing or trying to do the impossible, you do it even though you can't do it. And so there is a soul compound that is a product of the interaction. So that what we have done in the world of matter becomes spirit, but it isn't matter anymore, and spirit in doing that hasn't lost its spirituality. So we got to lose our head to our dismembered heart, which is what the grotto of Apollo is. Now, something else takes place at the time of this kiss. If you remember last time, when we were talking about Dionysius and Zagreus, the Platonists said that the mirror that Dionysius or Zagreus was fascinated with when he was killed by the Titans, remember he was ripped to pieces also, he became fascinated with the image in the mirror and he literally dove into it. This sort of thing happens when we look into each other's eyes. We see a reflection of ourselves and we see something of the other person, and we dive into the other person, and we become like the other. We become ourselves, more ourselves when we're loving somebody else, but we also become like the other. And this is a very dangerous phenomenon that from the spiritual point of view is called inversion. The personality, when the spirit in waking consciousness pours into it, becomes boldly assertive. And then the personality becomes Orpheus. And the real world becomes illusionary. The real world is the spiritual world. Eurydice so much loves Orpheus that when she sees that spiritual reality, she becomes it. And there is a changing of places. So that the Eurydice then represents the spiritual. And for a man in a personality, I am seeking an inner bride. I'm not seeking an Orpheus. And in matter, we become in a realm of illusion. This is something that takes place every time that you pass from the world of life to the world of death, and this is the world of death. The viewpoint changes. And before you leave one world, you drink a cup of forgetfulness. And when you enter the other world, you drink a cup of remembrance. And the point of view, like every time I've had a chance to consciously leave my body, I've been terrified and I've clung to it. But I'm told that once you get on the other side, it feels so natural that the thought of coming back to your physical body is terrifying. And there's that kind of thing that takes place with an inversion. Now, the inversion, as it comes out in psychology, is difficult because it has become materialized to the point that if you read Freud and even Jung, they see the unconscious as a product of the physical. Not the other way around, but a product of the physical. And they go to great lengths to show that we have hereditary things, that I would have the hereditary pictures of German mythology in me, and I shouldn't be looking at this Greek stuff at all, and such like that. And they think that there is a racial factor to the unconscious and that it is all produced by the physical. Moreover, they relate it to the past of physical material evolution only, and therefore the unconscious for both Freud and Jung, both branches of analytic psychology, is a tremendously primitive thing. They don't recognize the difference between the spiritual worlds. They don't recognize microcosm and macrocosm, so they have this sort of cluttered term, at least Jung does, have this sort of cluttered term that is called the collective unconscious, which would, from the spiritual point of view, take into account the universal spirit as well as the reflections of that in the personal memories of an individual in a personal subconscious. So the psychology is difficult, very difficult. Now, it is true that we do have a large backlog of destiny from past lives that is pretty primitive and savage. And it is true that the ethers and matter do carry remnants of past experience, and that is pretty primitive and savage. But nonetheless, there is a very big difference between the two views. Not to say that that view is wrong, because analytic psychology has a very good understanding of some of the principles that work in the soul. And they have very excellent methods for dealing with them and helping. It's a really helpful, curative sort of thing. So it's a thing that human wisdom and insight can be amazingly accurate, irrespective of poor metaphysics. If they had clairvoyance, they would probably see things differently. If they had the mystery insights. The really good thing I find about studying analytic psychology is it brings out the story side of the soul and not just the functioning of the soul as in a mechanistic way. Now, to get to the crux again, Jung is perfectly correct in saying that we can't take the waking consciousness, the brain-mind consciousness, and put it into the unconscious. The mystery schools would say the same thing. Only the mystery schools would say you can become wakingly consciousness in the spiritual worlds, in the unconscious, but you have to have a different kind of consciousness. You have to evolve and transform your consciousness. So they're perfectly right. And they're perfectly right in saying that the content of the unconscious certainly can't enter into this full waking consciousness. There's no way something that has the fluidic, unlimited qualities of the spiritual world can ever be put into the physical. That's the problem of distribution that we were talking about last time. But it is possible to become aware of the spiritual parts of our soul nature, to be self-conscious in them, and to bring the effects of them into the material world so that the material world can be digested and consumed and taken back into the spiritual, and the unknown becomes the known. If we do not do this, if we do not digest our experience, then we have a death that is worse than the death of the body. It is a death of the soul, which is a terrible, terrible kind of reversion. It's a reversion to thinking that the material is all that there is. I know it's getting a little long. I'll break off in just a few minutes here. I cut out about a third of the talk already because there are just so many things I wanted to get into that couldn't do it all. So there are two different varieties of waking consciousness, but these two varieties, I'm going to talk, let's just not follow this off really slowly. Let's just finish it off really quickly. Not only are there two varieties of consciousness relating to the inner worlds and the limitations of the outer worlds, and not only can we expand each of them somewhat into each other's realm and transform each other somewhat to each other, but both of them in the process. See, I'm trying to talk about the inner marriage in such a way that we're awake in our persona as ourself. But then there is another part of ourself that is divine, that seems to function and rule the whole world. And that kind of consciousness is very different. The consciousness in this world seems to resist that world. And that world seems to be unattainable to this one. But it is possible for them to marry by giving oneself fully to both kinds of consciousness and transforming. And when they're married, such that the spiritual consciousness sees the insides of what we objectively see with the material kind of consciousness, there is a process then of soul digestion of experience, and the essence of the world is brought into the spirit. And what happens in the process of this is that the two kinds of consciousness are both then swallowed up in an over-consciousness. And from the cosmological point of view, at the same time that spirit is being materialized and matter is being spiritualized and the creative work is going forward, the memories of it all are dissolving the experiences and going back into the spirit, so that the whole process is itself being dissolved back into the state of potential. So that what takes place when we awaken the two kinds of consciousness and marry them so that we look from the inside out and the outside in, we then see through it all in the oneness. And the two states of spirit matter fuse into each other, and both of them are digested and swallowed up into the one, which it doesn't make any difference whether you call it spirit or matter or whether you call it potential. And this is the process that is begun by initiation. And this is what the wedding is. This is of Orpheus and Eurydice. This is what the frustrating task is of trying to bring the soul into the material. You know, like we want to be perfect and we want the divine to come into us, assuming now that Orpheus represents the personality. And we want to give ourselves over to our divine lover. And so this is the process, and this is the problem, is seeing the two types of consciousness, each maintaining its own integrity and yet flowing into the other and bringing that into a state of unity. All right. This is the psychological process. I'd like to go into saying how it is done, because little by little, year by year, from turning inward and getting a hold of myself, I think I understand more now how this takes place. But it is a marriage of entering into each other's life. And it is indeed a resurrection from the dead. And it is a resurrection from the dead where we actually enter into the realm of the death and do it. So next time we'll look at three other kinds of interpretations, one of which, and all of the three interpretations will be different from what we've looked at from all of the other mystery myths of Demeter and Persephone and Dionysus and Isis Osiris. In fact, one of the interpretations will be so shockingly different that I don't even know how to approach the subject at all. And then we'll look at Orpheus Lyre, and then we'll be done with mystery myths. So let's just leave thinking about putting this almost like an Orphic hymn into a paradoxical little statement. And it's something that I think about, and it's something that I think about sometimes to just bring it back to mind. Part of it is common to biblical mythology, and if you take the whole of it, it has a lot of spiritual principles. It goes something like this. And the two shall become one, and the one is three, and the three are one, and none shall be lost. That is the crux of the Orpheus myth, as sort of like a little Orpheus hymn. And the two shall become one, and the one is three, and the three are one, and none shall be lost. You understand that if you go into that, if you ponder that one a lot, you'll find out that it opens up a lot of corridors of thought. Sorry for being so long.